Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Aspetar Wednesday webinar series. Today is March 17 from a very warm Doha. Today's topic for our Wednesday webinar is the supplement use in sport. Is it really a risk, and can they make a difference? So very interesting topic. I will tell you a little bit about it. The first thing I'll tell you is that I have no financial disclosure or conflict of interest with the presented material in this presentation, and I will not be discussing off-label uses of medications. So just get the conflict of interest statement done before we get into the details. So first of all, I would like to introduce the topic so you can understand a little bit what we are going to discuss this afternoon. So supplements in sports is a very hot topic. A lot of people talk about supplements. A lot of people that have worked in sports in different positions or with different expertise or as athletes have been experiencing supplements or the issue of supplements in sports. But I would like to use an analogy to introduce the topic. As a fond fan of spaghetti Western movies, this is one of my favorites from the Italian director Sergio Leone, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. And I think this describes very well the situation with supplements. So the good thing, which is the first thing we're going to cover, is that we know that there are some supplements that can be very beneficial to athletes' performance. And the recent IOC consensus statement on dietary supplements and the high-performance athletes identified the fact that supplements that claim to directly or indirectly enhance performance are the largest group of products that are marketed to athletes. But unfortunately, from the evidence in the literature that we have from the various studies that have been conducted, only a few, which include caffeine, creatine, specific buffering agents, and nitrate, have a very good evidence of benefit, which means that there is a lot of supplements out there for which there is almost no evidence or no evidence at all, which are proposed to athletes or used by athletes. Now, the bad about this is that at some point, athletes everywhere in the world experience things like that. So somebody becomes positive to an anti-doping test, and many times there is a reference to a supplement or a group of supplements that has been used. So one of the most recent and high-profile cases has been the case of an Australian swimmer, Shiner Jack. And this is a reminder that there are some dangers with engaging with sports supplements, using sports supplements, and prescribing sports supplements to athletes. The bad and the ugly are also important to know. You know, it's a big industry. It's a 37 billion supplement industry. It's barely regulated, and there's a lot of dangerous products that slip through the cracks because the ability to prepare supplements, the regulations about how supplements are prepared and dispensed and sold, is not really to the same level of medications, and therefore there's a lot of things that can happen. So some of the data that we have that are publicly available are showing that there is a lot of undeclared ingredients that can be found in supplements. So this is something that was reported in a study from Tucker et al. In 2018 in JAMA Network Open. And in 317 weight loss products from the US Food and Drugs Administration tainted supplements database, there was a variety of things that were found into supplements, ranging from sibutramine to ephedrine to analogs of sibutramine to fluoxetine to all sorts of other drugs, as well as sildenafil, Viagra, or analogs of sildenafil. And why that happens is a question for the industry, but these things do happen. And when these things happen, they put the athlete at risk of a positive finding in an anti-doping test. The other thing that we also know about supplements is that, unfortunately, there is lots of visits to emergency departments as an adverse event to the use of some of the supplements. So in this particular paper, they reported 23,000 emergency department visits linked to supplements use. And of those 23,000 visits to an ER department, more than 2,000 were hospitalized annually for consuming a herbal or a complementary nutritional product for weight loss or increased energy that was, for some reasons, either contaminated or contained undeclared ingredients that were harmful to people's health. And when we look at the breakdown of the product category, it seems that the main culprits for these hospitalizations or visits to emergency departments are products that are advertised for weight loss, or supplements that are advertised to boost or provide energy to athletes, supplements that are advertised for cardiovascular health, or vitamins, calcium, iron, or any other micronutrient. So we need to be wary of all these things when we consider using supplements in sport. And this evening we have three experts that are going to talk about it, and we will know more about all these aspects. So we have Daniel Kings from Aspetar that will talk about the risk of using supplements. So are sports supplements really a risk to athletes? Dr. Richard Allison from London in the UK, the Institute of Sport and Exercise and Health. He will talk about supplements and sports injury, what do we know and what is best practice. And finally, Michael Naylor from the English Institute of Sport in the UK, can you really win medals with just food? So this will be the basis of our roundtable at the end. So make sure you follow what the speakers have to say, write down a few questions, and please use the chat for any questions you might have, because I will moderate the session and I will be coordinating all the questions and answers. Make sure all your cameras are switched off, make sure your microphones are switched off, so the presentations can be going smoothly and we can have a good conversation at the end. So the first speaker for today is, so make sure your cameras and microphones are off, please, so we can progress with the seminar. So check your camera, make sure your camera is off. Camera and microphones off. So the first speaker of today is Daniel Kings. He is the Director of Clinical Projects in Aspetar, worked before with the British Olympic Association Rehabilitation Unit, British Military Forces, BBC, GB Olympic teams in various sports, Rugby Union for the Welsh national team and various football teams. And the title of his talk is, are sports supplements really a risk?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Marco, for the nice introduction. It's a pleasure today to have a look at something that's quite topical, which is always the case with sports supplements. And specifically start to have a little look at the last 5 years and see really what's happened. It's been quite interesting just listening to you, but also watching some of your slides flick up there, Marco, and inevitably in everything that you read these days, everything seems to stop at 2015 or 2016, and then your slide detail there is a classic case of that. So hopefully in recognizing there's a bit of a gap to acknowledge what's happened over the last 5 years, hopefully this session will help bridge that gap, as well as providing some good context around this area, this important area for athletes, sports supplements. So with that in point, I don't have any conflicts of interest to do with any sports supplements or foods that may be mentioned in this session. Today's session is very much going to be navigated through a few areas. So to break it down to help meet some of the learning objectives, I've chosen to split it up into kind of five key areas. First of all, we'll have a little look at the supplement definitions and some of the previous evidence. Move on to why the risks exist, how they've been addressed. Importantly, are they still a risk? And perhaps to consider some of the key challenges that do still exist and the future opportunities. To really answer this question of are they still a risk, we have to really start to first consider what actually do we mean and try and define by a sports supplement. I hope you enjoyed reading the IOC consensus statement of 2018, which in my opinion was a fantastic piece of work for a number of reasons. Firstly, because it's really the first in-depth body piece of work which IOC, in my opinion, have published around dietary supplements, which is very sort of proactive and reflective of the current trends of athletes taking sports supplements. And then secondly, as a practitioner, it really does help us in the decision-making process, both if we're working formally with athletes or trying to educate at athlete support personnel as they support athletes themselves. So the key bits, there's a lot of good detail in that IOC consensus, but to start with, what I really want to try and do is to bring it to this supplement definition. Now, in the consensus statement, they refer to four real key areas of classification, which hopefully you would have kind of started to think of when you're reading that, is that there seems quite a bit of greyness and possible crossover in some of these categories. And that's very much still the case. Whilst the definitions of supplements have moved on, there's no doubt, a universal definition still remains very elusive in the academic field, in the practical field. As a practitioner, the way that I tend to go around classification is to look very much at the functional intent of the sports supplement, and I try to use this as a baseline on which to educate the athlete and or the athlete support personnel as well. And I've tried to give a few examples of these down the bottom here. So I tend to look at supplements in the context of sports foods, medical supplements, ergogenic aids, plants, so botanicals, and then also a relatively new area over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, which is this area of superfoods. I think it's really a good starting point also, as well as looking at a definition of supplement, is to really find out why we're in this current situation. So, really what evidence has led to some of the actions that have been taken, and some of the precautions and statements that various bodies, professional bodies, have made over the last sort of 10 or 15 years. So there's no doubt that the first bit of work that was really started to be produced was 2001 and 2002, which is a pretty huge international study, which eventually got published in 2003. And that particular study is the base study which started to highlight that a lot of supplements had prohormones, steroids, and stimulants in, to the extent that actually these particular ingredients could trigger an adverse doping violation for tested athletes, but also for the wider sporting population, that they were potentially a general health concern, because a lot of these substances weren't actually being advertised that they were present on the label. As you can see, as we move along the various years, I'm not going to go into each particular one, but really there's a couple of standout papers for me. The one in 2003 by Gaia was no doubt the tipping point, if you like, to bring it to everyone's attention. I think from being based in the UK, a white paper published by what was a WADA accredited lab called HFL back in 2008, which, similar to the international study, but highlighted 10% of supplements in the UK market were contaminated with steroids or stimulants. That for me was a particular thing that was closer to home, and made us really look internally into how we worked with supplements and how we worked with athletes to provide supplements in the UK at that particular time. But then really, the HFL sort of publication, a main publication of a European study across 12 countries, based on non-third-party tested products at that particular time, was really another focal point for me, in that it really did start to ask questions, because of the products that were tested and found to contain prohibited substances, a lot of them were actually claiming that they were doping free. It also started to ask some questions around testing parameters and thresholds, which have led to some good work, which is based on some of the third-party testing program thresholds we see today. And ultimately, the last piece of work that we kind of see really of note was another white paper which was produced this time by a lab called LGC, which for historical reasons used to be HFL, but LGC is an independent lab, which I'll go on to further into the presentation. But another independent lab white paper produced, this time purely based in Holland, which examined the integrity of sports supplements in web shops, and again found alarming levels of substances which were perceived by their ministry as possibly damaging to health, which led to a number of withdrawals of specific supplements from the shelves. So quite a comprehensive picture over a 12 or 13 year period. A lot of white papers published by accredited labs as well as independent authors. But that kind of thread has continued over the last few years, mainly looking at sort of subpopulations and beliefs, practices and knowledges of those subpopulations. The ultimate question then is, well, what's really caused this particular risk? Well, there's no doubt that a significant factor is that sports supplements have got increasingly popular with athletes. And here is an example of some of them, some sports supplements which may have strong evidence for certain athlete groups to be using as part of their training and or competition program. But there's no doubt that marketing also have had a huge impact on the perception to the wider sporting public on the possible benefit of some of these sports supplements to their own what they perceive as sports performance. So for the wider sporting public, there is no doubt that this has had an impact. But I guess from an elite perspective, a key talking point is also the increase of use because of the fear factor, the fear of losing out, that during competition, they might be starting a competition at the same time as their peers who actually may have taken some of these supplements that may have shown to have a positive impact on that particular performance. So there's no doubt there's a fear factor as well that's caused that increase in demand in the population taking supplements. Risks are also heavily due to manufacturing. The modern day approach, just to be aware, is that not many companies that sell sports supplements actually manufacture themselves. They actually order products to be made in big manufacturing facilities, and these facilities are often places where other products are made, things for the beauty and fitness and medical industries which really don't have the same level of requirements to do with the anti-doping side of things, and therefore their ingredients which are going into some of these products may differ in terms of the integrity, but also more worryingly for the athletes is the diversity of products that could be made in this facility. Sometimes the way that some of these ingredients are stored and the lack of appropriate cleaning process can mean that certain residues can be left which can contaminate their products which have been made, leading to a possible anti-doping risk if they're going to be tested. So we have some pretty huge concerns around the manufacturing side. Also, more recently, as the economies have got tighter and our profits have come to the fore even more, some companies have looked a little bit further afield for their ingredients. Cheaper ingredients don't necessarily mean the best quality. So it's not only the cross-contamination risk in the factory that's the issue, but it's also the possibility of poor quality ingredients getting into the supply chain, into the factory even before the process of manufacture has started. So we understand why the risks exist, but how have they been addressed? Well, I think WADA, the World Anti-Doping Authority, I think they've been very thorough, obviously, in the way that they've tried to approach this in two ways. So first of all, it's the liability of the athlete is very clear. But secondly, certainly over the last 3 or 4 years, you will note that it's not only athletes that are liable, but also practitioners can face sanctions as well. And I think that's really important, given the some of the information and the first line information that's provided by athlete support personnel, which could include coaches as well as nutritionists, physiotherapists, for example. So I think that's certainly two ways that the risks have been addressed. Another way is to start to consider how to approach things in terms of the liability, and more importantly, very much if something does negatively happen to the detriment of the athlete, triggering an ADRV from a possible contaminated supplement. It's how the athlete can actually go around trying to prove their innocence, because in sports supplements, very much it's kind of the guilty until you prove your innocence kind of approach, rather than the normal way around in a court of law. So I think that's really important, and where this comes practically out is in Article 10 of the WADA code, and if you wanted the specific subsection, it's 10.5, where this statement actually comes from, where athletes now, through good due diligence, have the potential to try and seek exoneration or reduce sanctions where a negative incident happens. To give you some figures for those who are number orientated, between 2013 and 2017, approximately 4 to 19% of all adverse findings weren't sanctioned, and part of that was to do with dietary supplements and also meat contamination, which I will be going through in this particular session. So the WADA viewpoint is very strong. The liability remains 100% for the athlete, but what you've started to see over the last couple of years specifically are some interesting terminology and changes to some of the descriptions given by WADA in their capacity as an advisory body. And I've highlighted some of these words here, which are very important. So quality assurance schemes, and then reference to this thing called third-party testers. So this opens up a new area now where athletes, if they accept the risk that a sports supplement may have for their possible career and or reputation, if you like, third-party testing now offers an opportunity for those athletes to take on a process in that decision-making aspect to choose a product which carries potentially less risk than other products which haven't been through a more due diligent process. So third-party testing is in relation to labs, accredited labs, who undertake various levels of testing for various things, but also with included that can be for prohibited substances, on behalf of the supplement manufacturer, to ascertain if there are levels or thresholds have been exceeded of any substances of concern which could trigger an athlete to have an adverse doping violation. There are a number of third-party testing laboratories and programs in the world today, and there are various national anti-doping authorities now that have started to bring these into some of their NADA guidelines. And to the right on this slide, you'll start to see some of these things. So this is taken from USADA, who clearly identify the fact that if an athlete does decide to take a supplement and in sport and accept the risks associated with that, that they now start to recognise not only in this case third-party testing and recommend that that is a key part of the decision making in taking a process for an athlete, but in the context of USADA, they actually go as far in this case of actually naming the actual third-party testing program which they would recommend for their athletes. And in this case, it's America, so they've actually recommended a program called NSF, Certified for Sport. This illustration tries to give an indication of the several third-party testing marks that are available currently across the world, and where they are across the world, which NADAs actually recognise them and either recommend them for their athletes to include as part of their due diligent decision making when taking a supplement. And as you can see, Informed Sport as a global mark tends to be the most popular one, as opposed to some of the other countries, which perhaps in the case of, for example, Germany, Holland, Australia, they also have their own country-specific standards and their own marks, which they encourage their athletes to use. But some, for example, Australia actually have their own marks, but they also, as you can see here, actually recommend one of these other marks as well. Why do they do that? Because purely it increases the range of sports supplements that have third-party testing available to the athletes, but also in recognition that athletes do travel across the world, so may need to also access sports supplements in different countries. So are they still a risk? Well, we have to be very careful and navigate our way through some of the reporting that is made these days. And fortunately for the quote that you see by the person that made the quote, unfortunately people latch on and claim things have been an adverse analytical finding has been caused by a sports supplement, but in many cases when cases are open and investigations are started, this isn't actually the case. So we have to be very careful about what we actually read, in the press. But there is no doubt, and even the guy, Gaia, the academic who did the first key bit of work in 2003, even he published, he did a bit of work in 2015 using the same kind of countries, the same approach, analytical approach, and his conclusion was, as you see in the direct quote, things definitely have improved from supplement contamination perspective, and it definitely has decreased in recent years, and there's probably several reasons for that, as I've outlined in the bullet points below, but probably one of the major factors is that these contract manufacturers who manufacture products for supplement companies, there is an increased amount of testing because these companies realize two things. One, that they can't actually get into markets to sell the products unless they do the level of testing. Second of all, it's not within their own best interests from a reputation and from a business point of view to being linked also with contamination of a sports supplement. Access to data remains very difficult. So to answer the question, what has the incidence been, for example, over the last 6 years, we can't simply answer that question. What we do know is that some countries have been very open in reporting still, for example, Australia. In recent press over the last 2 years, for example, it still appears that 50% of their ADRVs are due to sports supplements. So that equates to approximately one a month. So that remains very difficult to really understand the true picture of how frequent sports supplements have triggered ADRVs over the last 5 to 6 years. It's important to note that regulation hasn't really improved. The third-party testing in relation to sports supplements that I've talked about is all voluntary, and that remains the case today. Risks still exist, and specifically in the evidence, muscle building supplements, fat loss, herbal products remain the biggest threat. And unfortunately now even food, as this picture on the right starts to allude to, with the rise of functional foods, which are foods which include novel ingredients. Food science and technology and taste capabilities these days in manufacture means now that anything can put into any format. And unfortunately, that now means that supplements or novel ingredients are being put into food products, which really does start to grey the boundaries, going back to my first slide and first part about what actually is a sports supplement. So some of the key challenges and future directions, just to finish off. It's important to be aware that not all third-party testing programs are the same, and this particular simple infographic gives you that picture. For example, the amount of drugs that are tested for differ. Different countries have different analytes and different thresholds. So very much it takes some navigation to work through what is third-party testing. And just because you see some of these labels at the top of this infographic on the side of a product, it doesn't automatically think what you might actually think it does. So when you're working with athletes and you're working with other athlete support personnel, it's really important to understand and get a good grasp of what some of these third-party testing programs actually involve. There's very good information in the main on their sites, and indeed that's where on websites, on their web pages, that's where the tested products in every batch get announced for athletes and athlete support personnel to make those informed decisions. We also have other things as well. So, for example, companies are quite smart and they keep using terminology that sounds convincing, like good manufacturing practice. But from a sport perspective, just to be clear, that doesn't mean that products have been tested for prohibited substances. There's no doubt there can be some improvements going forward. Better collaboration and transparency on the amount of analytics that is done, and in particular of the products tested, how many trigger an adverse finding would be very useful. There's no doubt as we move into this more sort of area of food and supplementation that better regulation and legislative actions is going to be a serious requirement. Across the whole of the third-party testing programs, there is no doubt that they all have to work better together rather than against each other. And importantly for athlete personnel is to be able to have a better insight into these programs to be able to advise athletes more appropriately. So I hope you found this particular session, which I've just overrun a little bit interesting. I've tried to sum up in 10 take-home messages. And I really do look forward to the panel discussion after hearing Rich and Mike speak, and more than happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Dan. I think it's a great introduction to the issues we will be discussing this evening. I think it's probably one of the main things we have learned so far is that we cannot trust anything, but also giving the advice of read the label might not cut it. So it might not be enough because we don't know what we're going to find in the label. So thanks again, Dan, for introducing this topic and with all this information about safety. The next speaker is Dr. Richard Allison. He's a consultant in performance nutrition and clinical dietetics at the Institute of Sport, Exercise and Health in London in the UK. He was the head of performance nutrition at Arsenal Football Club. And before joining Arsenal, he was a senior sports dietitian here in Aspetar, working with performance athletes in Aspire Academy, but also with injured athletes here in Aspetar. And over the years, he's worked with athletes from a range of sporting disciplines, from football, rugby, NBA, athletics, swimming, cycling, and combat sports. So wide experience also in the clinical world. And he will cover this very important topic, which is the supplements used with sports-related injury. And we will find out what we know and what's best practice about this topic.
Right. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to present in today's Wednesday webinar on sports supplementation. I'm going to present it for the next 20 minutes on nutrition and sports-related injury. What do we know and what is best practice? So, quick conflict of interest disclosure here, and then the learning objectives of this session. Let's give you a moment to have a look at those. And then without further ado, I'll start the presentation. So what I'm going to cover in the next 20 minutes is the physiological implications of injury, because it's important that we understand these before we can implement the correct nutritional strategies and what is the best practice here. And I'm going to demonstrate that in a case study and then provide some take-home points. So unfortunately, long-term injuries are unavoidable and they occur in athletes and recreational users alike. Often these injuries lead to immobilization, which can contribute to a prolonged decrease in activity, and this results in loss of muscle mass, strength and function, all of which I think are important in athletic performance. So a bit of a busy schematic here, but we need to understand that when an injury is sustained and it results in immobilization, there's a cascade of events which could go from basal muscle protein synthesis all the way down to reduction of muscle size, muscle strength, and therefore a reduction in athletic performance, which is something we need to attenuate wherever we can. So you've got the injury sustained, the immobilization because of the injury, and then if we put inappropriate or inadequate nutrition on top of that, that will impede the healing and recovery further. This will be typically from inadequate protein intake or energy malnutrition, or both, and this results in decreased muscle protein synthesis rates, exacerbates the inflammatory response, slowing wound healing, and therefore impeding injury recovery. So any nutritional interventions and or supplementation should focus on attenuating muscle losses and preventing energy malnutrition. So just to touch on immobilization, because this is a very important part of the injury process, it leads to muscle mass loss through increased negative muscle protein synthesis, and you have this decrease in muscle protein synthesis, but you also have the decreased response to the nutritional stimuli. So not only do you have the protein synthesis reduced, but any actual action to, say, the protein taken will also be reduced. And obviously this results in detrimental aspects to injury, and these include the downregulation of mitochondrial proteins and reduction in muscle strength. So again, things that we need to try and attenuate, as these are potentially very consequential to the athlete. So in terms of nutritional support, many nutrients and supplements and even nutritional strategies have been proposed to improve nutritional recovery. However, there is limited evidence for a number of these. So what I will focus on those with evidence, which are energy balance, protein and amino acids. Now, energy balance may not be a particular supplementation, but it's very, very important when it comes to injury recovery. As I'll come on to now, it's the appropriate energy intake is critical for both recovery, return to train or return to play. The exercise or the energy expenditure is decreased due to reduced training and activity in most athletes, and the immobilization will increase this even further. However, we have to understand that this decrease in energy expenditure may be less than expected, which I'll go on to the next slide, so careful consideration is needed. So energy expenditure can actually increase during injury. We also have to consider that if an athlete has had surgery, this may be considered a second injury as well. The increase in energy expenditure from 15 to 50% depending on the type and severity of the injury. We also have to consider, is a lower limb injury is the athlete on crutches. The ambulation can increase the energy expenditure by 2 to 3 times greater than walking. So the total energy expenditure may not have decreased as much as anticipated. And as working in sport as nutrition professionals, need to make sure that we're maintaining this energy balance and that the intake is matching the expenditure. And of course, adjusting this intake throughout the recovery process to prevent excess fat gain. So as with pre-injury, during injury and post-injury, carbohydrate is still king in the majority of sports, if not all, and periodization is very important. So in terms of the injury rehabilitation process, in an ideal world, the load would increase linearly throughout through the acute rehab all the way through to return to performance, and therefore our carbohydrate intake, or the athlete's carbohydrate intake, should marry that and again increase in a linear fashion. However, the real world doesn't look like that. Athletes become re-injured, demotivated, have setbacks, and therefore that carbohydrate intake needs to match that load to prevent that excess fat gain, but can't be too low, otherwise it will impede wound healing. Protein is the other key macronutrient when it comes to recovery from injury. As mentioned, inadequate protein will impair wound healing and exacerbate muscle loss by decreasing synthesis of myofibrillar proteins and reliant on the synthesis of collagen and other proteins. So we need to consider, when it comes to an athlete, the absolute amount of protein that they were taking and are taking now, and any reduction in that habitual intake may be detrimental to wound healing and muscle mass, and that athletes and recreational users tend to have high habitual intakes than non-exercisers. So it's important to take that into consideration. Now, evidence suggests that muscle protein synthesis is maximized when protein is ingested every 3 to 4 hours at about 20 to 25 grams. Now, when an athlete is injured, this may need to go up and to as high as 40 grams per session, and also that may be the recommended amount for an older athlete. So we need to take that into consideration as well. This is often done through protein supplementation, as delivering those boluses of protein sounds straightforward enough on paper, but when it actually comes to the practical application, cooking a chicken breast or whatever and giving that to an athlete every 3 to 4 hours can be difficult. We also need to look at the amino acid content of the proteins, and specifically leucine. Other nutrients where there is some evidence or good evidence for are creatine. This has been shown to decrease muscle atrophy and is a common part of any athlete's nutritional suitcase, if you like. It's been shown to increase muscle gains following 10 weeks of rehabilitation, but not in shorter periods of recovery. I don't know why, but again, this is a nutrient that's widely used and there's a lot of evidence for that. So that's got the seal of approval from the research and peer-reviewed science point of view. Omega-3s, also evidence to support their anti-inflammatory property and that they may also ameliorate muscle losses. Antioxidants is slightly more complicated. There is evidence to suggest that oxidative damage is thought to contribute to losses in muscle mass, and therefore in theory antioxidant supplementation would actually attenuate that. However, in studies that looked at muscle loss in rodents, which did show that they helped to reduce muscle loss, the equivalent would be problematic or potentially toxic in humans, so not a direct link there. There is a small amount of vitamin C, and that status prior to injury and prior to supplementation actually improves or correlates well with muscle function. One nutrient where there is emerging evidence and good evidence for is collagen. Collagen is the most abundant protein in the human body, and we're talking here about bioactive collagen peptides. And there's evidence to suggest that we are now lacking that in our diets compared to where we would have done a number of years ago due to cooking methods and not using, say, bone broth, for example. Collagen is reabsorbed in the small intestine. It therefore stimulates the mTOR pathway and also accumulates in articular cartilage. So there's evidence and theory to suggest that not only would it help to stimulate muscle growth, that it would also help to improve or heal articular cartilage injuries. However, we're waiting for more evidence on that. This is a study from 2017, where they supplemented a number of individuals with activity-related joint pain, and they showed after 12 weeks of taking collagen peptides that this pain was reduced, and actually they no longer needed additional therapies. One of the useful things about collagen is it can be delivered in a number of different ways. So it is a supplementation or a supplement that can be used as a shot or a gel, or as we used to use at Arsenal, we used to mix it as a gelatin-enriched vitamin C, and we put that into jellies, and we could make the jellies a variety of flavour. Particularly popular was the Red Bull flavoured jelly. So, you know, there's a bit of sort of play with it, and if you can mix it or incorporate it with real food, it does add another dimension than just taking a 60ml shot or gel every day. But before we look at any more sort of supplementation, we need to understand what the athlete is doing. So this is obviously an assessment part of the rehabilitation process. So we need dietary recall or assessment. Snap and send is often popular with athletes. It's very easy for them to take a photograph of a meal and send it to the performance team. Logging apps is also very useful, but a little bit more effort for the individual, even with apps that you can scan barcodes to make it very easy. We also need to understand the body composition of the athlete, so we can look at notable changes throughout their rehabilitation and see if, you know, the supplementation is working. Two methods that are particularly useful are DEXA. It's very quick, takes about 7 minutes, slightly longer if you're a larger athlete. It needs to be taken on the same time of day, and also consideration to hydration status. And from that, you'll get the bone mineral density, fat mass, and lean mass scores. Another method that's very useful is the kinetometry. Less popular with the athlete as it takes a bit longer, and they have to stand around being prodded, having their skin vods taken and bony breaths, etc. However, you do get more data. You get adipose tissue, muscle mass, residual mass, bone mass, and skin mass. But with all these things, there are limitations, and the body composition or the body fat percentage is one of those where athletes want to know their body fat percentage, but it's open to interpretation depending on which equation is used. As you see, this individual would be 17% on one equation and 7% on another. So obviously there's some significant difference there. But the idea, if you're using the same equation, you can see worthwhile changes throughout their rehabilitation. You can also look at muscle to bone ratio from kinetometry, which can be useful to determining how much lean tissue an individual can put on. So one of the main injuries that I've worked with, both at Aspetar and Arsenal, are the ACL injuries. They're a common injury, unfortunately, and they cause long layoffs, about 7.4 months on average, and that means that the nutritional support is very important throughout that period. The rate of the injuries has not decreased over the last 15 years, despite changes in turf, boots, the pace of the game, number of metrics, the ACLs injuries remain the same. And although the return to play rate is relatively high, around 90%, it has been shown that in elite European football, that only 65% of those who sustain a ACL are still playing top-flight football 3 years later. So it may not be a career-ending injury, but it is definitely a career-impacting injury, and therefore nutritional strategies need to be put in place to, you know, help an athlete recover the best that they can. So probably speaking to everyone who knows about ACL through this webinar, the rehabilitation is split into 3 phases. And in terms of the focus of nutrition, the initial phase, that's the 8 to 12 weeks post-surgery, up to 8 to 12 weeks post-surgery is the most important, where we can do the most good work, where we're trying to protect and minimize those lean tissue losses. And from data from Aspetar, we know that the average lean tissue loss post-surgery is around 4.9 kilos. So that's an awful lot of muscle mass to try and put back on if it can be prevented from from the loss in the first place. And then obviously it goes on to provide the athlete with a better foundation for the rest of their recovery if their lean tissue losses are less. So the nutritional interventions for ACL support should focus on optimizing that muscle protein synthesis, balancing the inflammation, and balancing overall energy with carbohydrate intake. So I'm just going to provide for the next 5 minutes a case study and then my conclusion, just to show the best practice in action. So this is a player, 23-year-old defender, There's statistics there, slightly higher perhaps body fat than you might expect, but this is a good percentage body fat for that individual. Fortunately, we'd worked for them for a number of years, and we were able to ascertain that was a good percentage body fat for them. The injury itself occurred during a match, non-contact injury up until the point the player was training regularly, left knee ACL, and they had surgery 6 days post-injury. Subjectively, the athlete was positive and understood the duration of inactivity and rehab, and this is unfortunately because they'd been around other players that had suffered a similar injury, and they were aware of how long it took them to rehab. They understood the changes in lean tissue body composition, particularly post-surgery, and we discussed the nutritional strategies and how to attenuate lean tissue losses, enhance healing, and reduce excess fat gain. One area where we looked at obviously is this trifecta, if you like, of how to promote performance, but in this case muscle mass. So we're looking at sleep, nutrition, and load. Now obviously load is off the table, particularly in those first 2 weeks. They can't do anything at all. But what also we need to take into account with this particular player and maybe other athletes or all other athletes is that his sleep was massively influenced in a negative way. He was in severe pain despite taking painkillers, which prevented him from sleeping, and also he was unable to move when he was in bed. He had to lay on his back, which had a big impact on his sleep. So basically nutrition was the only thing we could control in that initial period. So obviously we had to understand what their nutritional intake was like prior to the injury, and through the assessment it was ascertained that they had between 2,700 and 3,500 calories per day on average, and that's through a periodized approach, fueling for the work required. They also had 150 grams of protein a day, which was about 1.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, and 80 grams of fat. There was obviously the objective markers taken by DEXA, and we looked at obviously the total body measures, but also the injured versus non-injured limb, and the scans were repeated pre-surgically, 2 weeks, 8 weeks post-surgically. The DEXA showed that he had sufficient lean body mass and a good understanding of practical nutrition, that this evidenced by the DEXA. We also were able to compartmentalize the injured and non-injured limb to look at specific areas. Now, the nutritional side, we increased his dietary protein to 2 grams per kilogram body weight, put him on 20 grams of protein every 3 hours, and this was done for a combination of real food and protein supplementation. That was all Informed Sport batch tested. We balanced his inflammation with 6 grams of fish oil and turmeric, and we managed his carbohydrate intake down to 2.5 grams per kilogram body weight a day to try and minimize those fat gains. And of course, we aimed to avoid macronutrient and micronutrient deficiencies. So this is what the best practice looked like as a table form. So there was protein from real food and protein shakes, obviously again Informed Sport batch tested. Vegetables at every meal. The complex carbohydrate was managed, particularly at breakfast and lunch. Collagen shot was provided twice a day, again to provide that additional protein, but also the potential for enhanced recovery from the collagen. Creatine, omega-3, opti-turmeric, and a multivitamin were all supplied. We're looking at for subtle adjustments of those regular measures in body composition, but also an MDT approach, which enabled sort of whether it would be the physio, the S&C coach, or the masseur to reiterate these key messages, so that we would try and encourage the player to have best practice throughout. So in terms of body fat percentage, we were fortunate enough to have DEXA on site. So they had multiple DEXAs prior to the injury, which looked like this. And then he was trending nicely, had little increases we'd expect to see at about the 8-week mark. And then at 29 weeks was the highest percentage body fat he'd had recorded. Unfortunately, we were able to bring that back. And I'll explain why that happened in just a moment. And as you can see, that's reflected in fat mass increase and lean mass decrease. So the reason that the athlete had such a monumental or significant change at 29 weeks was the way the season fell, that he then went on holiday for a month at the end of the season. And during that time, didn't do the same amount of rehab, didn't pay as much attention to nutritional intake, didn't have as much supplementation because he left them at home, and this obviously resulted in an increase in fat mass and reduction in lean mass. In terms of the injured versus non-injured limb, we can see that post-surgery, or 2 weeks post-surgery, the injured left leg had a greater reduction in lean mass compared to the non-injured, but then about 8 weeks post-surgery, there was a non-significant difference between the two. And you'll remember that no athlete is completely symmetrical. So we were happy with the progress that he was making in terms of his injured limbs. So nutritional recommendations, that's what we're here for, was to increase total dietary protein to around 2 grams per kilogram body weight, 20 grams of protein every 3 to 4 hours while awake, balancing inflammation with fish oils and turmeric, and managing overall carbohydrate intake, and of course avoiding any micronutrient deficiencies. So on reflection with this particular plan, he maintained lean mass well immediately post-surgery following those nutritional interventions. The MDT approach and daily contact worked well, and the DEXA proved a useful tool for monitoring the dietary interventions. The negatives were the player let themselves go, in their own word, in the off-season, and measuring energy expenditure proved difficult. So it'd be nice to also have that data so that we could monitor and adapt carbohydrate intake accordingly. HMB, although the evidence for HMB is not that great, it would have been nice to look further into that, and also the sleep supplementation side of things, given that the sleep was so poor, particularly during those first 2 weeks post-surgery, when the greatest risk of losing or reducing lean mass is present. So in summary, there's still much to learn about the best nutritional strategies and nutritional supplements from exercise-induced injury. There needs to be careful evaluation, so we need to look at the evidence and which supplements there are evidence for. We need to look at a well-balanced diet. So although supplementation does play a role, food first has to be the way. We need to avoid deficiencies from a micronutrient, energy and protein standpoint. Energy balance is critical. We need to make sure that that doesn't impede wound healing, but doesn't allow the player or athlete to gain too much fat mass. Nutritional status and energy requirements should be assessed throughout. Higher protein intake should be considered, and there's promising evidence for leucine, curcumin, and omega-3s. But caution is warranted because there is an awful lot of supplementation out there where there is no evidence for, and a lot of snake oil salesmen. Anyway, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Richard, for the very interesting presentation. I think we've seen some interesting elements of combining food with supplements, some new compounds, turmeric, and using gelatin into a food, and something that athletes do tend to like. So it's good to see an approach, a mixed approach like that, especially for athletes in rehabilitation. But there is very good guidelines of what we should be aware of, what we should be wary of when we develop a program for athletes in rehabilitation, but also of all the options that there are out there. The last speaker of the seminar is Michael Naylor. Michael is the head of performance nutrition at the English Institute of Sport. He worked with Olympic and still works with Olympic and Paralympic sports, so very, very wide exposure to a variety of challenges in terms of sports nutrition approach. He was the head of sports nutrition for Team GB at Rio 2016 Olympics. He also worked with England Rugby, the English FA, and Southampton Football Club. And what Mike is going to do, and no pressure, Mike, really, Mike is trying to answer the question that everyone wants to know, which is, can you really win medals with just food? So the floor is yours, Michael. And just a reminder for everyone that after the talk that Michael is going to do now, we will have a panel discussion. So if you have specific questions you want us to answer, just make sure you write them into the chat, and I will use your question for the moderation. So hopefully we can have an interactive session here. So Michael, all yours.
Thank you, Marco. Just to check, you guys can see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. And thank you for lining me up with the really easy question of can you really win medals with just food? So thank you for Dan and Marco and the team for the invite today. And what I'm going to do is just talk around a few various stories from my world. So looking back into the work I've done in Olympic sport, in football, in rugby, and try and add a bit of context to that into this question. So hopefully it brings it to life a little bit as well and makes it enjoyable. Just on the conflict of interest disclosure, no actual or potential conflicts of interest, but have previously done small bits of education-based consultancy to the likes of Science in Sport and Optimum Nutrition. So when we're working in elite sport and it's full of problems, questions, challenges, and difficult situations which affects what we eat and our decisions around food and our decisions around supplements. So we're often traveling a lot, which can affect what we eat and food available, the tactics and the demands of the type of game that we play. Even in my time at Southampton, about 6 years, working with around 5 different managers, all of them had different ways of playing, which then affects their nutritional intakes and habits of how we want to play. Injury and how that can affect their nutrition and their use of supplementation, as Richard has just provided a great case study on that area as well. The effects of athlete staff and knowledge and their own opinions. The practical skills of the athletes. We work with some athletes, believe it or not, who actually struggle to cook at the basic of levels in some situations. We have athletes competing all over the world, which affects the food availability and the catering to them. So this picture here is actually from a sevens competition, which the athletes couldn't even recognize or tell what it was, but it was a part of a bird that doesn't often get eaten, especially to them coming from suburban London. And different clinical issues which affect what we eat. I'm going to touch on the likes of vitamin D supplementation later on, which might link to where different supplementations might play a role as well. Different learning and working styles of athletes and staff members, and also the weather and environment can affect what we eat. So what makes this question that I'm trying to attack today is all the different scenarios that we encounter in the higher performance worlds and what actually affects what we do. And what we can't do is just this supplement shotgun approach of just trying to throw all these different supplements into the mix, trying to get an effect from somewhere. It's about being a lot more calculated. So using this philosophy, one which we use in the EIS and across multiple organizations in the UK and worldwide, will be this performance backwards, not nutrition upwards, actually working backwards from the problem or the performance question or the challenge and creating nutritional strategies specific to that, rather than just coming with a toolbox of nutritional strategies and trying to add that application to any situation and scenario. So it's about being really tactical and strategic with it. And as Richard quite notably said, nutrition alone doesn't win medals, and it's about working in a multidisciplinary fashion, interdisciplinary fashion. So all strategies are combined and delivered to the athletes in an effective way to actually make a difference. I'm going to touch on this because the word food first has been thrown around a lot in recent years, and we've kind of gone in a circle in trends of nutrition. There was a period of time, maybe 15 years ago, where supplements are actually seen as a bad word, and everything should be done via food. And then it kind of flipped 360, and then all of a sudden it was people trying to look for that edge constantly and thinking about supplements and not even thinking about more of the fundamentals of nutrition. But I think where we are now is actually in a really sensible place where we think food first, but not food only. We're starting to understand that, supplements can play a role to support performance, but we need that foundations of food to be really good in the first place and make sure we're building on that in the right way in this sort of pyramid. And an athlete will often eat around 2,160 times a year. So they're eating a lot more times than they actually train. So these become fantastic opportunities to actually make a difference to your performance by just selecting beneficial foods to put on your plate. These are gains that you can obtain, which you don't need to go out training for hours for or include that intensity. It's just that thing around behavior change and having the psychological mindset and skills to select the right meals that can actually make a difference for you and support your performance. And thinking about it in a way around performance at the center of it, and nutrition can play a role by supporting and maximizing the adaptation from your training sessions. So sometimes this could be as simple as just changing body composition, reducing body fat, increasing mass, or some more tactical adaptations such as trying to increase mitochondrial proliferation via underfueled training sessions. We can use nutrition and alter nutrition and supplementation around injury and illness prevention and management, looking into and leading on to some of the great work that Richard has just discussed and talked about there. And I'm going to talk about how nutrition can play a role directly at competition day or match day, relating back into some of my experiences in football as well. So I'm going to start with quite a basic topic and quite a basic story, but it's an absolute fundamental story around nutrition, around fueling and maximizing our fueling for competition events. So I've taken this from some football research, and a number of researchers have shown this, particularly muscle glycogen stores can deplete in many athletes during the duration of an endurance event, or even like this example from football coming from my world. So we know a reduction in glycogen stores or depleted glycogen stores can have negative effects on performance. So this could be related to reduced concentration awareness, reduced duration of work, reduced intensity of work, impaired accuracy of passing, or different skills that are required for the game, and potentially at times increase the risk of injury or illness. So we know that low glycogen stores at the wrong time can have negative effects in these sorts of situations. So when we start looking a little bit deeper into that, we know from a lot of the work that John Hawley have done and the likes of James Morton at Liverpool John Moores University, that carbohydrates become king in many situations. And as Richard touched on, the likes of fueling for the work required becomes pivotal. So I've taken this from a bit of work that we've done at Southampton FC around nutritional periodization, the green squares representing high carbohydrate meals, red lower carbohydrate meals, and the amber are moderate. So as you can see on a single game week, there's a general build up in their carbohydrate intake, leading into an increased amount of carbohydrates to maximize glycogen stores for performance for their games. If it's a double game week, you can see there's a lot more green squares because a lot more carbohydrates required to help support and maximize performance at this time. And then as you build into the more specifics of it and building into what does that actually amount of that carbohydrates look like. So being involved in a number of teams, we've actually called it and labeled it something like Project 6G, where we're trying to get athletes to consume 6 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight. So even in some situations in football, but particularly in rugby, a 100-kilo player or athlete isn't uncommon. So that looks like 600 grams of carbohydrates as a sort of baseline level on that day before to help maximize glycogen stores in preparation for performance. Which is quite a lot in a lot of situations. So if you look at it in just food amounts alone, you're looking at around 12 jacket potatoes, which is a lot of food, and it's hard to consume. And that's why sometimes the carbohydrates, sports-based foods or supplementations can become useful in that situation and scenario. It becomes even more complex in situations where you've got to perform on back-to-back days. So I've taken this example from one of the England Sevens players from the last Olympics, and then trying to consume that amount of carbohydrates on a day where you have to perform and play as well, but you want to be ready for the semi-finals and the finals on the next day, becomes hard by just food alone. So then that's where things like the carbohydrate gels can be a useful format to do that. They're convenient, easily digestible, and provide you with that fuel source that's instant to perform. Plus, it's also helping you fuel your recovery and fuel for your performance again the next day as well. In-game carbohydrates, one of the things that we've done in football and rugby is you start to treat it like an endurance event as well. And this is how we ended up getting in gels onto the football pitch at the last World Cup, because we saw it as a pivotal component of our game, is to actually top up especially our blood glucose stores and the carbohydrate availability of the carbohydrates during the game. So it's hard to do that with food during this time, but the likes of the carbohydrate gels provide a convenient way for us to be able to do this and achieve this. So a lot of the time, the convenience of these sorts of products make it a lot better to help us deliver our strategies. And there's times where some of these gels, for instance, are engineered in a more specific way for different performance goals. So they might have caffeine in, or might have nitrates in, or different products like that, which can actually help us further make easier the delivery of different nutrients that might have an effect on the performance goals that we're trying to achieve with the athletes. Following on from some of the things that Richard said around protein requirements, protein can be, you can get enough via food a lot of the time, and it's relatively easily to do that. But even going back to that rugby example, when you need to get an amount of protein in at the end of the day because you're struggling to get it in during the day, then sometimes supplements can play a role to make a more convenient example of protein from here. And I'm not going to repeat a lot of the stuff that Richard discussed around the frequency of protein, trying to consume 20 to 30 grams of protein every 2 to 4 hours, and especially sources that are rich in leucine, which make it a little bit harder in some situations. And then there's different sorts of athletes as well. There's athletes who might have vegan eating preferences, and then even getting protein in via food, especially when you're trying to get it in this frequently, becomes really tactical and challenging, because you could spend all your day cooking different foods to try and get the proteins, amino acids in that you need to help facilitate recovery or maintenance of muscle mass or muscle mass development. So even the individual requirements can tailor your decision making on whether supplements are actually necessary to support performance in this situation. And I'm just going to reflect back from Rio with Team GB, with the Olympic team there. One of the things there was actually trying to help the athletes and make it as easy as possible for them to hit their carbohydrates and protein requirements and micronutrient requirements at times. And the amount of take that it works, and the actual benefits of working with great chefs to actually bring across and bring alive nutrition strategies as well. And we absolutely maximise the use of our S&C coach, Alex Wolf, in this situation, delivering the meals to the athletes in their different performance venues in carefully selected packed lunches, bags, which we use to add a bit of character and entertainment to the games as well. There's situations and scenarios where it's not so easy to get what you need via food. So for the likes of carbohydrates and protein, there's plenty of food options out there, and it's easy to obtain it. But with some of the micronutrients, it can be particularly harder. And there's been a lot of research, particularly in the likes of vitamin D. And I've taken this work from Daniel Owens, Graham Close, Liverpool, John Moores, and Richard, who's just talking previously. And it gives Asker, you can drop, by the way, give him full credit. He can make these tables look far prettier than me. But it provides an example, especially here in the UK, where our availability of sunlight and vitamin D3 via sunlight is extremely rare, especially during the winter months. And if you have got a vitamin D deficiency, then a vitamin D3 supplementation can become a very, very useful tool and a very useful supplement to have as part of your toolbox to consume to help support that deficiency. So it becomes something that is actually really hard to consume via food, and supplementing may be beneficial in this example. And then there's products that the likes of what Daniel touched on in his first talk, where you've got the likes of creatine, beta-alanine, and dietary nitrates. All these are foods that are supplements which have been shown in many cases to have positive effects when consumed for the right events at the right times in the right amounts to make a difference. So these, again, are nutrients that are hard to get from food alone, and the amounts that are going to have an impact on performance. So these are situations, in specific situations, where we might choose to use these supplements because we can't get them via food, and they can potentially make a difference and further increase the possibility and chances of success. The fantastic IOC consensus statement, which has been referenced multiple times already today, provides some excellent resources for this on the hierarchy of scientific evidence, and the bit I'm going to relate to from this is actually being really specific and relating to that first slide from myself today, and actually what are you trying to achieve, and actually being specific with that. And is a supplement the answer to that, or can you be it by food? So will supplement X protocol improve in a 400-meter swimming race? And then looking at the level beneath that and below that as well. And if you need to perform that race twice in the same day or over multiple days, what effect does it have then? So it's about going into the depths and the details of the supplement use, and will it actually make it have an effect? And then again, a slide taken from Asker, where he's actually interpreted the decision-making component of the IOC paper, and this come from the SCNR position statement as well, which Graham Close put a lot of work into as well. And it's around actually understanding the evidence behind a supplement. Is it really needed? Is it going to make a difference in that particular situation? Is it safe? Is it from a reliable source before considering its use? So it's all about going through a good decision-making tree to make sure that you are using supplements for the right reason, they are safe, and that you can actually try and monitor and see the effectiveness of it, whether it's going to make a difference. And over the years, done bits of this in football. So examples of taking it back to the world that we work in, the context that we work in, the players that we work in. As Richard said, a lot of the time it's a very individualized approach, and the likes of the Australian Institute of Sport have done different groups of supplementations that EIS has as well. But what's got to be really relevant is that you've got to make it individualized. You've got to bring into context the situation, scenario, the players and teams that you're in. And looking back at Southampton a few years ago, the basic supplements that we wanted to use, where we felt we actually had enough rationale from a performance and research basis, the list looked really small, and it can end up just being more around carbohydrate gels, electrolytes, caffeine, creatine, and vitamin D, iron, calcium on an individual level. In that group B sort of phase, there'd be the likes of beta-alanine, probiotics, nitrates, essential fatty acids, and collagen in more recent years. And then beyond that, in the group C and D, where there was pretty much no evidence and it's just purely marketing, is what makes up the rest of the supplements that are available on the market. So as you start to narrow in on a really specific situation and scenario, the actual amount of supplements that might be relevant for performance actually comes a lot smaller as well. So coming back to this question of, can you really win medals with just food alone? It comes back to the overarching performance sort of solutions model as well. Like nutrition or food alone can win medals. There's so many multiple factors involved that actually contribute to make that. A food first, but not always food only, is a good approach to take. Be specific and deliberate with strategy implementation. So actually really take the detail of understanding what you're trying to achieve. Be evidence-based with the approach that you take. And coming back, can you really win medals with just food alone? Most of the time, and many times you can win with just food alone, and many athletes have, but this still comes with the big caveat that it may depend, and that depends on the individual, their circumstances, and the clinical deficiencies they may have, or particular performance demands of the sports, where supplements might be beneficial to help and support them to make a difference. Thank you.
I think we've seen quite a comprehensive overview of the issue with supplements and performance, the risks, the benefits, what works, what doesn't work, what might work for performance, what works for rehabilitation. I think we can kick off the panel with one of the questions that I always had. You know, it seems to be an impossible mission to have data on the frequency of adverse analytical finding that can be directly attributed from sport supplements. So, you know, what's your knowledge and experience so far? What kind of supplements seem to trigger those adverse analytical findings in anti-doping tests? Do we want to start with Dan?
Remember to turn my microphone on. That's always a good first start. Yeah, thanks. I guess if we look at the literature, the last sort of paper published looked at a period from 2013 to 2015, 2016. And a couple of countries were in there specifically, and they cited between 6 and 8.5% of the total ADRVs in those particular countries were attributed directly back to contaminated or other things to do with sports supplements. So from a literature perspective, that's what we know. There haven't, to my knowledge, been any other papers published, certainly over the last 2 or 3 years, of that similar approach. And I guess in my talk, that's what I meant by access to data is really quite difficult, because even when you try and go into the individual anti-doping authorities in different countries to try and get an overview, because sometimes there's quite good reports in different countries, it's a heck of a lot of work just going through one country. There doesn't seem to be a central point of information where stats like that are readily available, which is slightly odd at a time when we're trying to really push an anti-doping message, in regard to sports supplements. And I'm sure Mike's got a bit more practical knowledge from my side reading the literature. Still, the main supplements of concern in the last publications are still the muscle building supplements, the fat loss supplements. Specifically those ones seem to have triggered quite a lot of anti-doping violations over the last few years. I think there's clear cases in cricket as well as other sort of weight making sports. And with the rise of things like herbals and botanicals, they're very difficult to do test for analytically in the third-party testing program for a number of reasons. So they're the three main supplements which we still kind of advise our athletes to be very careful of. And ultimately, we tend to say the more ingredients it's got in terms of supplements, potentially the higher the risk. What do you think, Mike? Is that a fair analogy, or am I off the pace there?
No, it's a fair analogy in many situations and scenarios, and I think sometimes it does link to a lot of those products, such as fat burners, which there is actually little to no evidence but behind them, and they're throwing multiple different ingredients in, trying to make them new, novel, over-engineer things in many situations, and that's the bit that causes problems in a lot of situations and scenarios. And pretty much the likes of testosterone boosters and all of these different supplements that you'll see from mainly online retailers in many situations, rather than the reputable ones that we'll see on the shelves of many shops. But it's it's in those sorts of products definitely where we see more risk and what more athletes have failed to in recent years.
Good. I want to ask something else actually around supplements and trends. What always fascinated me is the fact that there seems to be trends or trend waves on supplements. I remember a few years ago, everybody was taking creatine monohydrate. It was super popular. Then for a few years was saponins like Tribulus terrestris or anything like that. Then in recent years was beetroot juice. What's your comment on that? I mean, Richard, you work with a variety of athletes in different parts of the world, in different kind of settings. Did you experience any of that?
I'd say one that links that actually the previous question, this one together, is CBD oil. That's the one that I would say personally gives me the biggest headache, because there are a number of athletes who see their competitors, friends in other sports using CBD, which obviously for those that don't know is not informed sport batch tested. It's going to, for the evidence that I've seen and the conversations I've had with LHC, is a long way away from being anywhere close. I'd like an update. So that's the trend at the moment, and I've had individual athletes who have seen their competitors using CBD and gone with almost the old cliche comment of, well, they didn't fail a drugs test, so why shouldn't I take it? A genuine comment. So that's the one I see a lot at the moment, is the CBD oil.
Yeah, for the ones that are not aware, what CBD means is cannabinoids. So anything involved with cannabinoids is a red flag as soon as you hear the word. Anyway, but Mike, do you want to comment on that?
I can only, yeah, I think as Richard said, that's been the biggest trend over the last year, for sure. And I think that there's this element as well where many athletes are constantly looking for an edge over their opponents, and nutritional strategies are a way to do that. And they are looking for, for magic bullets in some situations, but the reality of it the actually evidence behind a lot of these isn't there, and a lot of the trends can sometimes be led by marketing rather than true, good, solid scientific evidence. And I think that becomes a pivotal role of support staff and nutritionists working with athletes, is to actually help them and guide them through a robust strategy to actually look at the evidence rather than just following trends, which can sometimes be led by, you showed an example of how much money is involved in the supplement world right now, which the marketing that comes along with that can be pivotal in influencing athletes at sometimes.
Dan, have you seen any regional differences in these trends, or is it a worldwide phenomenon?
Well, it's quite interesting. I mean, we've just written. I mean, you'll summarise it at the end, I think, but we've just written an article now that from Mike was involved in the roundtable that contributed to the article. But we asked that question really: what are the global trends to do with sports supplements? And we all kind of, between the four of us, we were actually coming up with the same things, and we all live 5, 8, 10,000 miles away from each other, and we work with different populations of athletes and the wider sport community in different cultures, and we were all coming up with the same thing, from working with people, but also from what we read as well. And I guess the top ones were definitely novel functional foods. They're a massive driver of the industry at the moment. CBD, collagen, as Rich has gone into, is a massive one, and again, that's probably fueled because of the leverage from the beauty industry, globally. And then the other ones that are starting to come through are the more botanical ones, like the quercetins that are linked to immunity. But below that, then we've got this kind of emerging area, which is really super interesting, to do with the gut. And brain function and all of these things. And it used to be pre and probiotics, but now there's a new kind of area that's really interesting of postbiotics that seems to be coming through as well. So that's a snapshot of what we kind of had a consensus about with the global trends at the moment.
Excellent. This is very good to hear. We have a question from the audience, from Heather Foster. Heather is asking to all of you, where is the best place to go to for the best evidence in supplements and nutritional advice, in particular for young elite athletes? Who wants to start? No pressure. I'll go to Dan. Come on, Dan. We can start this one. You work with youth athletes here. Where would you go?
So look, I think one of the pandemic is obviously a very negative thing globally in a lot of ways. One of the positives that's come out of it is that you no longer have to travel long distances to go to conferences to listen to very, very key, influential, practical academics in the world of sports nutrition. There's a lot of very good webinars at the moment, and I hope this would be kind of an example of that, to share some good practice. But when you go online these days, a lot of the applied academics do have their own sort of sites which they willingly share commentaries on, and they're unbiased commentaries. That's the key thing. I think, Mike, you had on one of your slides, you had Jaska's site, My Sport Science, for example, up there. I mean, that's one of the ones that I tend to go to for views on various things, to check and challenge my own translation of papers. But look, there's other resources as well, podcasts like the IOPN, so Institute of Performance Nutrition websites that used to be podcasts that used to be the Guru Performance ones. They've got very, very good information on there as well, and they're a mixture of academics and also very applied practitioners who work in all sorts of different sports. So for me, those are the two areas that I would go for, not just generally for young adolescents, but for general sort of sport and performance nutrition sort of information.
Michael, anything to add there?
Just a couple of others. I'll just list in a few places where I go to some of the times. Again, there's a lot of great stuff on Ask You Can Drop's website. Even though working for the English Institute of Sport, I still have to say that the Australian Institute of Sport are probably the best at putting a lot of good information out to the public as well. And even in some sport-specific worlds, there's the likes of the England Rugby have put a lot of work into a nutrition hub on there, and youth athletes and rugby players has been a key component of that as well. So I think look for the reputable authors who aren't going to be biased, and and you'll find some really good stuff out there. But there's some good resources there, and of course, what a platform here to learn from.
Okay, I will. We have a few more questions, and we will move to food now. So we should also make sure that people understand that we should never be also 100% sure about food sources either. A few years ago, there was all this issue with the clenbuterol contaminated meat, allegedly, in different parts of the world. And so how important is, when you're traveling with teams or to train camps, to make sure that you have safe food supply? Should we be concerned if you are a traveling athlete? Richard, you were traveling a lot with the Arsenal around the world. So what was the kind of stuff that you were doing?
We had procedures in place. Myself and the travel chef would make sure that we knew where all the sources were coming from. This only really became major issues for, say, tours to China, or when we were in the Europa League and going to Azerbaijan, where we weren't so familiar with the culture and where to source things from. So yeah, it was just sort of going through those very strict procedures, because although it's perhaps not as likely to happen as you sort of alluded to, it's obviously a risk that you don't want to take. So you need to know where this particular meat's coming from, and then also there's the all the produce that's available in the hotel, and the athletes should, in theory, only ever eat at the hotel or the stadium. We know where that's coming from, so we've done our best sort of due diligence there. The other sort of side of that is then to give the players education. So a few years ago, pre-season tour in China, there's some delicacies out there, as Mike alluded to, and just telling them to avoid it, because there could be less serious ramifications, such as food poisoning, all the way through to a doping violation. So it's best to abstain in that case.
Mike, you have the fresh experience of sorting out catering for holding camps for Brazil a few years ago for the Rio Olympics. Anything to say about that experience, what you look for and what you do?
First point, it's a headache, and I have spent many hours probably going through similar stories to what Richard has and Dan has in the past as well, is trying to get traceability and understanding and assurances of where things come from. And you can, in a controlled environment, and you can get that level of documentation, but then it becomes the strict piece of advice to only eat in the environments what you can control. Don't go out eating in different street markets. And as a lot of athletes will want to get out of the bubble that they're in times and get out to different places and have a coffee and a snack. And that's when it gets uncontrolled. So it comes back to doing as much due diligence as you can for the food that's being provided. And at major competitions, they're really good, they're really open, they give you those assurances and can show traceability. But it's when they can't show the traceability, then it takes that bit of extra work. But at the same time, it becomes about working with the athletes to ensure they stick to protocol as well and eat in the places where you've done that due diligence.
Good. Dan, anything that you've experienced?
Yes, more headaches. I guess, you know, just to be completely authentic. I mean, when I was really working in depth in teams like Mike is now, and you know, at that level, I guess a lot of the expectation was actually put on you as a nutritionist to be going into a kitchen, and they'd expect you to be like a glorified chef. So a lot of my work when I was working with teams was actually convincing management in the professional teams that we should be taking chefs with us to key parts of the world where we knew that there was going to be a higher than normal threat, whether it's from a hygiene perspective or, you know, a traceability of meat or other food sources. So actually a lot of my work, you know, in those early days was spent convincing team managers and stuff that they should actually be taking chefs rather than nutritionists, which didn't really go down, you know, that well with some professional groups. But that's the reality, you know, we have to accept our competencies. You know, we are not chefs, and you know, where all the stuff is important happens in the kitchen, and you need that professional, competent, analytical mind to be able to pick through the bits that are really important. You know, I mean, the broken sewer pipes in kitchens when they're cooking food, you know, which I've experienced, you know, they're all plain for people to see. It's the stuff that you can't see that's the real problem. And this is where the expertise of the chef over the nutritionist, I'm happy to admit and gladly admit, really come to the fore. And I think this is why over the years, you know, there's been a real positive change in mindset of professional and serious teams in taking chefs, if not all the time, to you know, priority places in the world. And I think that's something that's an interesting conversation to have around mega events like the World Cup as well, where perhaps, you know, countries are hosting those events and they're not anticipating countries bringing their own chefs, and the complexities, you know, of personality dynamics that then ensue when a chef walks into another chef's kitchen. That's another ball game altogether. So I think that's kind of a quick snapshot of some of my experiences, you know, from a food point of view, really, in kitchens.
Yeah, so I would like to wrap just this question with this. It's probably a word of advice is organic might have different meanings in different parts of the world, so don't take it for granted. We have a very interesting question from Dr. Celeste Gersima. It's how important do you think is for sports nutritionists to teach players and athletes to cook their own high quality meals? And also, is it possible that athletes use supplements simply because they don't know how to prepare food? It's the easiest thing for them to do, in particular for protein intake. What's your view? Where do we start? Who starts? Who starts first?
I'll kick this one off, Marco, because
Yes.
Again, something really passionate about, and as Dan highlighted on earlier, over recent years, the integration of performance chefs has been pivotal to help the delivery of many of our strategies in elite sport. But at the same time, as well as delivering at training grounds and hotels, it's actually getting them to coach athletes how to cook as well, and especially younger age groups. But you know, even in the likes of England Rugby, we've done coaching sessions with the senior men's first team. So it's pivotal not just for young athletes, but all athletes, because those skills are essential. And we put together different kitchen coaching workshops and curriculums to actually ensure that the athletes had a lot of these skills, so they didn't need as many supplements and they didn't feel the need to them or want them, because they felt that they could get the majority of their nutritional needs, if not all of their nutritional needs, in by actually cooking really good, tasty, delicious food which held the nutritional value as well.
Richard, you're also working in the clinical setting with, young people that have issues with food. How do you think it's important to teach them this aspect, not only for athletes, but just for a healthy lifestyle?
I think you've hit the nail on the head with the question there, Marco. I'll take it out the clinical and just take it back into football, where you'd have a first team dressing room, where you would have genuinely someone who had a chef living in their house who produced every meal for them that they didn't have at the training ground, all the way down to a first team player that still lived with their mum and dad who didn't know how to, and it sounds almost cliche, didn't know how to boil an egg. So, putting those basic cookery skills in place helps obviously to have a better understanding of the food itself. And I've personally found that when an athlete or a client has a better understanding of the food itself, they're more likely to adhere to it because they have an understanding of what that is, as opposed to you just handed them a paper diet plan, which may or may not be effective, depending whether they follow it or not. So I think the education allows them a greater understanding, and it can take different forms. So you can have the in the kitchen session with a chef. You can have the basic sort of in other roles we've done cookery, just basic cookery skills. There's in the UK at least, and there will be in other countries, but there's companies that deliver the raw ingredients and the recipe for those meals, but you still have to cook them yourselves. I've found that's quite popular with athletes that are willing to learn, because it's sort of almost that halfway house. They haven't got to go to the supermarket and think about the food, but the food's delivered to their house, and then they've got to think about the process of actually producing the meal. So that's a sort of halfway house between, knowing nothing and being able to sort of cook and deliver your own food.
Dan?
Yeah, so I guess to answer Celeste's question, starting with the second part, I guess a lot of people, take supplements because of convenience. It's not so much that they think that they're missing something in the diet all the time. It's just because they're in modern day lifestyle, and I would include elite athletes in that, because of publicity duties, all this sort of stuff. It's a convenience factor, and this is the main, I think, speaking for all of us, this is where the novel functional foods concern comes in, is that the more stuff that starts getting chucked into foods as additions in terms of supplements, this is a concern. So convenience is definitely a problem. I think a perception is an issue as well. So, for example, a lot of people might take a protein supplement straight after training because they think they have to after training. The reality is there's a pretty big window of time over a couple of hours for somebody to get a protein feed in using real food. It's just that they automatically assume that they've got to put the powder in a shake and shake it and throw it down their neck. So again, using Mike's analogy, it's a performance backwards approach. If you're gonna be able to go home within a couple of hours and eat a decent meal that's got a decent source of clean protein in, you don't necessarily have to rely on supplements in and around your training. So I think there's an education point from there. And then the final point is something. Educating the kids is really important, but I think in this day and age, educating the parents is just as important. I'm a dad. I've got two. I've got a 15-year-old and a 19-year-old. I know I don't look that old, but I'm lucky in that I've had the background that I have. But I go to events, the same events here in Doha that you go to, Marco, and we constantly get asked by parents of young, serious athletes, some of which are in like elite sporting academies in the UK, about what their kids should be eating, what they should be cooking at home. A lot of the work to do is around actually upskilling the people who oversee the kids, and I know that's an area here that we struggle with. particularly, because perhaps, you know, culture comes into it and a way of cooking comes into it, and you've got an added extra problem there to try and overcome. Not just, you know, advising somebody from a sport perspective. You've got to come over some real cultural barriers as to changing the main meal, you know, which is very complicated. And in some cases, even the parents don't cook. There may be maids, or there may be other ways that the kids or the parents access their foods from an extended family. So it's quite a complicated area. But to summarize from my side, I think that convenience, I think, you know, a lack of education from, you know, why people need to take a supplement, do they need to take it, and also then a little bit of a lack of ability from the parents' point of view, I think is where, you know, we really need to start to focus on when we're trying to change some of the attitudes of our young athletes.
Great. I'll close with the last question, which is just along those lines. So I ask you to be brief in your answer. You know, we talked about athletes, we talked about parents, but actually many times the pressure to take supplements or needing supplements comes from the coaches. So how much do we do, or should we do, to educate the coaching community about the fact that many times athletes don't need to take a particular supplement? Michael, you deal with them every day.
Yeah, I think from multiple factors of nutrition and elements of nearly all performance, the coach education and giving the coaches a better understanding of what we do is pivotal around a number of issues. I think even the language used around supplements and like multiple other factors we're involved in as sports nutritionists, even like weight management and all of these different areas, the more insights and more knowledge that we can give coaches, the less we're taking to chance and allowing them to give advice from resources that might not be as evidence-based as what we're providing. So I think definitely that piece around interdisciplinary work, a key component of that is actually sharing knowledge and education and taking the time to have those conversations, which might not be too formal educations, but what education sessions, but it allows that opportunity to get philosophy and understanding across to reduce the risk of coaches leading those conversations and you know, providing advice which is not effective and in some cases actually dangerous.
Richard, you had great support from Arsene Wenger when you were at Arsenal. How important was that?
It's key. So I'd echo exactly what Mike has said, and then with that also allows you to inform the coach the importance of nutrition and the correct use of nutritional supplements, because you can also have the converse where a coach, particularly in football, has no interest in nutrition at all, thinks it doesn't matter, and that can therefore have a downstream or knock-on effect to the way that the players see things as well. So I think it works both ways, and it is actually fantastic when the manager's got your back and he's willing to support you. It does make your life as a practitioner a lot easier.
Dan, closing comments?
Yeah, for me, two things really. Ties into one of my slides in the future directions. I think the third-party testing programs and labs have got a real role to play in this, and you know, be very, very good with giving better insights into the sports supplement industry, and I think that's key. And then the second thing is, I think, you know, there are some countries, for example, in the UK, you know, you can't work around a certain level of athlete without actually doing a yearly National Anti-Doping Association program. So in the UK, it's the UK Anti-Doping one, and in there, you know, that's the best practice in terms of education of coaches, athlete support personnel, where this area of sports supplements is picked up. And I think so standardizing that approach globally and recognizing where and what the best practice is for other, perhaps more developing sporting nations and NADAs to actually start to take on and not be afraid to use other countries' you know, education programs for coaches and athlete support personnel. while they develop their own, I think is really essential.
That's actually become a key component on nearly every job description of every one athlete facing in the Institute of Sport, is that they have to do their UCAD qualification. And there's an area of governance around it as well, in that we have only supplements should be provided in the UK by SCNR qualified nutritionists to put that level of governance around it as well.
This is excellent to know. So I think, first of all, we can close. We've gone a bit longer, but I think it's been really worthwhile. I think it's been a fantastic webinar, and I hope that the attendees agree with me. So I would like to take the opportunity to thank the speakers, of course, for the excellent content and the very valuable discussion that we had at the end. I think it's been great, and I hope everyone agrees. Then I would like to thank the medical education department. They put together all these things. They do all the regulatory work to make sure that these webinars can be recognized and provide continuing education credits of value. They do a fantastic job. And in particular, Sophie and Alice, which has been working behind the scenes to make sure we don't ruin the technology and we are able to actually deliver the content that we do. So well done, Sophie, and thanks for your help. A couple of announcements to make. If you are interested in nutrition, I can anticipate that there is going to be a special issue of our Aspetar Sports Medicine journal, which will be fully dedicated to nutrition. It's almost ready to go, so watch this space. It will come out very soon. It's a free resource you can download, and there will be a lot of interesting content there. Also, we do a variety of events that are, of course, free to attend. One is the Tuesday lectures. This month is all dedicated to calf injuries. So if you are interested in calf injuries, this is what's happening. All the lectures are saved and stored into our YouTube channel, so you can go there and see them at your leisure. And also we have a monthly sports medicine collection series forum, and at some point very soon there will also be a special one on nutrition. Again, is a free event. You just need to register and sign up, and it will be again another very interesting evening to talk about nutrition topics. So again, thanks to all of you for the time and effort, for the content. Thanks to everyone that was attending for the time and patience to listen to us, and looking forward to meet you all in the next event here from Aspetar. Bye.